In every narcissistic family, there exists an invisible division, a line that separates the children into two distinct groups: those who can seemingly do everything right, and those who will never be good enough. If you grew up with siblings and always felt that there was a brutal difference in the treatment you each received, you weren't imagining things. Carl Jung revealed the psychological mechanism behind this division, and what he discovered will completely change how you understand your family. Because the truth is that both the golden child and the scapegoat have been broken, just in completely different ways. Let me explain something that most people never realize about narcissistic families. They function as a system, not as a group of individuals, but as a machine where each person has a specific function. And in this machine, the narcissistic parent is the center. Everything revolves around their needs. And the children? The children are pieces, tools, extensions of the parental ego that serve different purposes. Jung called this projection. The narcissist can't handle certain parts of themselves, the good, grandiose, perfect parts. They need to see those reflected in someone. The bad, shameful, flawed parts. They need to expel those outside of themselves. And guess who receives these projections? The children. One child receives all the idealized qualities. This is the golden child, the favorite, the one who can do everything right. The other child receives all the flaws and thus all the shame, all the anger that the narcissist can't admit to within themselves. This is the scapegoat, the rejected one. And here comes the most disturbing part. Neither of them is being seen for who they really are. The golden child isn't loved for who they are. They're loved for the image they project, for the extension of the narcissistic ego that they represent. The scapegoat isn't hated for who they are. They're hated for what they represent, everything that the narcissist can't accept in themselves. Both are just blank slates where the narcissistic parent projects their own internal drama. Neither is seen. Neither exists as a real person in the eyes of this parent. But hold on, because the dynamic between these two roles is much more complex than it appears at first glance. And understanding this complexity is crucial for anyone who grew up in this type of family. The golden child seems to have all the advantages. They receive constant praise. They're treated as special, unique, superior. When they make mistakes, their errors are minimized or ignored. When the sibling makes a mistake, the errors are amplified, used as proof of their inferiority. The golden child grows up believing that they're better than others, that they deserve special treatment, that the normal rules don't apply to them. Sounds like an easy life, right? But the reality is very different. The price that the golden child pays is invisible. They completely lose contact with who they really are. Their identity merges with the expectations of the narcissistic parent. They don't know where they end and where the image they must project begins. Every compliment they receive isn't for them, it's for the performance. Every validation is conditional. The moment they fail to be perfect, the moment they show any vulnerability, the love disappears. And they know this at some deep level. The golden child knows that the love they receive isn't real. It's based on performance. It's transactional. If they stop being perfect, if they stop reflecting the grandiosity of the parent, they'll be discarded. So they live in constant anxiety, constantly trying to maintain the mask, constantly afraid of being discovered as the imperfect person they really are. Jung would say that the golden child has lost their true self. They've identified completely with the persona, with the social mask that they were forced to wear. And when you identify with the mask, you forget that there's something underneath. You forget who you really are. The mask becomes you. And that's a form of psychological death. Now look at what happens to the scapegoat. They receive the opposite treatment. Everything they do is criticized. Their successes are ignored or minimized. Their mistakes are amplified and used as proof that they're defective. They're the black sheep, the problem child, the one who always disappoints. When something goes wrong in the family, the blame falls on them, even when it's clearly not their fault. The pain of the scapegoat is obvious and visible. They grow up believing that they're inherently flawed, that there's something fundamentally wrong with them, that they don't deserve love or acceptance. They internalize all the negative projections of the narcissistic parent, and these projections become their inner voice and their internal critic, the narrative that they tell themselves about themselves. But here's something that most people don't realize, and that Jung would have pointed out immediately. The scapegoat, despite all the suffering, often preserves something that the golden child has lost completely: their identity. Because the scapegoat was never accepted by the family. They never had to mold themselves to narcissistic expectations. They never had to wear the mask. They were rejected for who they are, which means that at least they know who they are. The golden child was accepted for a false version of themselves, and they spent their entire life maintaining this false version until they forgot that it was false. The scapegoat was rejected, but remained whole. The golden child was accepted, but fragmented to maintain the acceptance. This doesn't mean that the scapegoat had an easier life. The pain of rejection is brutal. The trauma of being constantly blamed, criticized, invalidated, leaves deep scars. Many scapegoats develop chronic anxiety, depression, difficulty trusting others. They spend their lives trying to prove that they deserve love, that they aren't as defective as they were led to believe. But the crucial difference is this: when the scapegoat finally wakes up to the family dynamic, when they realize that they were a victim of a sick system, they have a self to rebuild. They can go back to who they really are because they never stopped being that person. They were just taught to hate who they were. The golden child, when they wake up, is faced with a void. They take off the mask and there's no one underneath. They spent so much time being what their parents wanted that they completely forgot who they were before that. The healing journey of the golden child isn't rebuilding the self. It's building a self from scratch. It's discovering, for the first time, who they could have been if they had been allowed to exist. Now let me show you how this dynamic develops over time, because the roles aren't always fixed. In some families, the roles of golden child and scapegoat can alternate. One day, one child is the favorite. The next day, the favoritism shifts. This happens because a narcissistic parent's love isn't based on who their child is, but on how the child is serving the narcissist's needs at that moment. If the golden child fails at something important, if they disappoint mom or dad in any way, they can be temporarily demoted to the role of the scapegoat, and the scapegoat can be temporarily elevated if they do something that pleases the narcissist. This constant switching creates an even more toxic dynamic. The kids never know where they stand. They never feel safe. They're constantly competing for parental approval, constantly afraid of losing their place. And this competition is exactly what the narcissist wants. Because while the kids are competing with each other, they aren't questioning the system. They aren't realizing that the problem isn't their sibling. The problem is the parent who created this dynamic in the first place. Carl Jung would call this triangulation. The narcissist positions the children against one another, creating alliances and rivalries that serve only to keep the narcissist's power at the center. It's like divide and conquer, but inside your own family, and the effects of this triangulation last a lifetime. Siblings who grew up in narcissistic families often have difficult relationships with each other in adulthood. Yeah, there's accumulated resentment. There's competition that was never resolved. There are roles that continue to be replayed, even decades after moving out of the house. The scapegoat may resent the golden child for receiving preferential treatment. The golden child may resent the scapegoat for not having to maintain the mask of perfection. Neither one can see that they were both victims. Both were pawns in the narcissist's game. Both were used. But here comes what most people never understand, and it changes everything when you finally see it. The choice of which child will be the golden child and which will be the scapegoat is not random. It's not based on who's more talented or more problematic. It's based on factors that reveal a lot about the narcissistic parent's psyche. Often, the golden child is the one who most resembles the narcissist, whether physically, in personality, or in talents. They're the mirror that reflects back the idealized image that the narcissist wants to see of themselves. The scapegoat, on the other hand, is often the child who most reminds the narcissist of their own flaws, or who reminds them of someone the narcissist hates. It could be an ex-partner. It could be a relative with whom there's conflict. It could even be aspects of themselves that the narcissist rejects. In some cases, the scapegoat is simply the more sensitive child, the more empathetic one, the one more connected with their emotions. Because this child sees through the mask, this child realizes that something is wrong, and that threatens the narcissist. So, they need to be silenced, invalidated, discredited. The sensitive kid who speaks the truth that no one wants to hear is dangerous to the narcissistic system. So, they're labeled as dramatic, exaggerated, problematic. Their perceptions are denied, their reality is distorted, and they grow up believing that their sensitivity is a defect, when in reality, it's a gift. Carl Jung spoke extensively about how the shadow works in families. The shadow is everything that we reject in ourselves, everything we consider unacceptable and push into the unconscious. And in narcissistic families, the shadow of the parent is projected onto the scapegoat. The scapegoat carries the shadow of the entire family. They become the repository of everything that is shameful, flawed, unacceptable. And this serves a very specific purpose. It allows the rest of the family to feel clean, good, acceptable. As long as there's a scapegoat to carry all the darkness, everyone else can pretend they're light. This explains why often the entire family participates in the dynamic. It's not just the narcissistic parent who mistreats the scapegoat. Siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, everyone can get in on the game. Because if the scapegoat is the problem, then no one else needs to look at their own problems. It's much easier to point to one person and say, "There's everything that's wrong." That way I don't have to examine what's wrong with me. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because you project it onto someone else. Jung was very clear about this. The projected shadow is still yours, and until you integrate it, it will continue controlling your life in ways that you don't even realize. The golden child, for example, carries an enormous shadow that they don't recognize. All the arrogance and all the coldness, all the inability to empathize that they developed to maintain their position as the favorite. All of that is shadow. But they don't see it. Because from a young age, they were taught that they're perfect, that their flaws don't exist, that any criticism is unfair. So the golden child grows up without the capacity for honest self-assessment. They can't see their mistakes because they were never allowed to have mistakes. And this makes them extremely fragile. Any criticism, no matter how slight, is felt as a devastating attack, because it threatens the entire structure of identity that they built based on being perfect. Many golden children develop their own narcissism. They learn from the parent that manipulation works, that people can be used, that the world revolves around their needs. They internalize not only the projection of perfection, but also the narcissistic behaviors that they observed their whole life. And this is perhaps the deepest damage that the role of golden child can cause. Not just the loss of identity, but the transmission of the cycle. The golden child can become the narcissistic parent of the next generation, and their own child can become the new scapegoat. The cycle continues. Jung would say that the only way to break this cycle is through what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, separated from the roles that were assigned to you, separated from the projections that you received, separated from the expectations that you internalized. For the scapegoat, individuation involves realizing that the negative projections that they received were not about them. It involves separating the voice of the parents from their own inner voice. It involves recognizing that the constant criticism, the guilt, the treatment of inferiority, all of that was about the parents' problems, not about who they are. This isn't easy. After years of being treated as defective, it's extremely difficult to believe that you aren't. The critical voice is so deeply internalized that it seems to be your own voice. It seems to be the truth. It seems to be reality. but it's not. For the golden child, individuation is even more challenging, because first they need to recognize that the image of perfection is false. They need to admit that the pedestal where they were placed was a prison, not a privilege. They need to face the shadow that they spent their whole life denying, and that requires something the golden child rarely develops: humility. The ability to admit they're not special, that they're not superior, that the rules apply to them just as much as they do to anyone else. And this fall from grace, this tumble off the pedestal, can be devastating for someone who's built their entire identity on being better than others. Many golden children never make this transition. It's easier to keep believing they're special than to face the emptiness beneath the persona. It's easier to continue the narcissistic cycle than to do the painful work of building a true self. But here's something that few people talk about, and it could be the first step towards healing for both roles. The golden child and the scapegoat need each other to heal, not in the way their parents planned, as rivals competing for scraps of love, but as allies who finally realize they were victims of the same system. When the scapegoat can look at their golden child sibling and see not a privileged rival, but another child wounded in a different way, something shifts. When the golden child can look at their rejected sibling and see not a loser who deserved their fate, but someone who paid the price for their own protection, something opens up, because the truth is, the system only worked while the siblings were divided, as long as each saw the other as the enemy. No one questioned the parents, no one saw the game, no one realized that the roles were arbitrary, that they could have been switched, that they had nothing to do with who each child really was. According to Jung, these are archetypes at play within the family dynamic. The moment siblings from narcissistic families unite is the moment the system starts to crumble. And that's why narcissistic parents work so hard to maintain the division. They know, on some level, that their greatest threat is an alliance between their children. Let me tell you how this dynamic manifests in adulthood, because the patterns don't stop when you leave home. The adult scapegoat often has difficulty in relationships. They attract partners who treat them the same way their parents did, people who criticize them, who make them feel they're never good enough, who replicate the dynamic of rejection they've known since childhood. This happens because we tend to repeat what's familiar, even when what's familiar is painful. More than that, the scapegoat often doesn't believe they deserve something better. The message of inferiority has been so deeply ingrained that they accept mistreatment as normal. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy rooted in early childhood experiences. The adult golden child has different but equally destructive problems. They may have difficulty maintaining relationships because no one will ever be good enough for them, or because they expect to be treated as special all the time, and most people don't do that, or because they don't know how to have real intimacy, since they've spent their entire life performing instead of being. Golden children often have marriages that look perfect on the outside, but are empty on the inside. They know how to create the appearance of happiness without feeling real happiness. They know how to maintain the image without having the substance, and when their own children arrive, the cycle threatens to repeat. The scapegoat may become overprotective, trying to give their children everything they didn't receive, but this overprotection can create new problems. Or they may, without realizing it, repeat the patterns they internalized. They may become excessively critical with a child who reminds them of their own childhood self. They may project onto that child all the fears they carry about themselves. The golden child may create their own golden children and scapegoats. They may replicate the exact system that shaped them, because it's the only model they know. They may have a perfect child they exhibit as an extension of themselves, and another child who receives all the negative projections. This highlights the cyclical nature of family dysfunction. Jung would say that what doesn't become conscious becomes destiny. The patterns we don't recognize continue to control us. The traumas we don't heal, we transmit. The wounds we don't face, we pass on to the next generation. But the good news is that consciousness changes everything. The moment you see the pattern, you start to have a choice about it. The moment you understand the dynamic, you can choose not to repeat it. You've just discovered something that most families go generations without realizing. You've just seen the mechanism that divides siblings, that creates rivals where there should be allies, that transforms children into tools of the narcissistic ego. This knowledge is power. This understanding is the first step towards breaking the cycle. When you click the super thanks, you're saying that this kind of truth needs to be known. You're supporting a space where family wounds can be named, understood, and finally healed. You're helping to break the silence that allows these patterns to continue. Now, let me give you the signs that you're starting to heal from this dynamic, whether you're the golden child or the scapegoat. The first sign is that you can see your sibling with new eyes, not as a rival or enemy, but as another victim of the same system. This doesn't mean you need to have a close relationship with them. Some siblings choose to keep their distance, and that's valid. But the internal shift happens when you can look without resentment or superiority, when you can see the wounded child that they also were. The second sign is that the critical voice of your parents starts to lose its power. If you were the scapegoat, that voice said you were defective, inadequate, never good enough. If you were the golden child, that voice demanded constant perfection, threatening to withdraw love in the face of any failure. When that voice starts to feel external, when you can recognize that it's not your voice, but the voice that was implanted, you are healing. The third sign is that you stop seeking the approval of your parents. The scapegoat often spends their life trying to prove they are worthy of love. The golden child spends their life maintaining the performance in order not to lose love. When you realize that this approval will never come in a genuine way, when you stop chasing it, something is liberated. The energy you spent trying to please people incapable of real love can be redirected into your own life. The fourth sign is that you can establish boundaries. In narcissistic families, boundaries are crimes. The scapegoat has no right to boundaries, and the golden child can't have boundaries because it would break the image of perfect availability. When you start to say no, when you start to protect your space, when you stop allowing treatment that hurts you, you are rebuilding the self that was denied in childhood. The fifth sign is that you stop defining yourself by your family role. You are not the scapegoat. You are not the golden child. You are simply you. These were roles assigned to you in a sick system. They do not define who you are. When you can see yourself beyond these labels, when your identity is no longer trapped within the family dynamic, you are individuating in the sense that Jung described. The sixth sign, and perhaps the most important, you begin to treat your own children differently, or, if you don't have children, you stop repeating the patterns in other relationships. You can love unconditionally. You can see people as they are, not as projections of your own wounds. You can create bonds based on who the person really is, not on how they serve your narcissistic needs. Jung used to say that the journey of individuation is the journey of becoming who you really are. And for children of narcissistic families, this journey begins with a specific task: separating who you are from the projections you received, discovering the self beneath the role, finding the person who existed before being labeled as perfect or defective. The scapegoat needs to discover that the criticism they received was not about them. They need to find the qualities that were denied, the talents that were minimized, the worth that was always there but was systematically invalidated. The golden child needs to discover who they are without the mask of perfection. They need to face the flaws that were denied, the shadows that were hidden, the vulnerability that was never allowed. And both need to make peace with the child they were, the child who was arbitrarily divided into categories of worthy and unworthy, the child who only wanted to be loved and was used as a tool in their parents' psychological game. There is a Jungian practice that can help in this process. It's simple, but powerful. Find a photo of yourself from when you were a child, preferably before the age of 6. Look at that photo. Look into the eyes of that child and ask them, what did you need that you didn't receive? If you were the scapegoat, perhaps that child needed to hear that they were good enough, that the criticisms were not about them, that they deserved love simply for existing. If you were the golden child, perhaps that child needed to hear that they could be imperfect, that they didn't need to perform to be loved, that it was safe to show vulnerability. And then, tell that child what they needed to hear. Say it out loud. Say it as many times as necessary, because healing happens when you can give yourself what your parents couldn't give. When you can be for your inner child, the parent they deserved to have. The golden child and the scapegoat, two sides of the same toxic coin. Two roles in a system that saw no child for who they really were. If you were either of these roles, know that the role doesn't define you. Know that the projection wasn't about you. Know that it's possible to heal, it's possible to break free, and it's possible to finally be seen for who you really are. Were you the golden child or the scapegoat in your family? Comment down below and tell me how that role has affected you in your adult life. And if you were the middle child, the one that nobody saw, comment too. All the roles have their wounds. All deserve to be recognized. I'll be responding to everyone in the next few hours.